James Collins was a man who had built his life from the ground up. He had grown up in a small town, with humble beginnings, and over the years he worked hard to create a successful career in business. His company had grown over time, and now, at the age of 32, he was the owner of a thriving empire. James was known for being hardworking, focused, and driven, but there was one thing people always seemed to mention when they talked about him: his lack of a personal life. James had never been one for relationships. In fact, he avoided them entirely. His past had taught him that love wasn't worth the pain it often brought. Years ago, he had been in a serious relationship with a woman named Emma. They had been together for several years, and James had thought she was the one. But when Emma had left him without explanation, his heart had been shattered. It wasn't the first heartbreak he had endured, but it was the one that had closed him off from the possibility of ever loving someone again. Since then, James had kept his heart locked away, focusing only on his work. Despite his success, his family never let him forget that he was still single. Every family gathering, every holiday, his mother would ask, "James, when are you going to settle down? You can't be alone forever." His father, though a little quieter about it, had similar thoughts. There were always quiet hints that his business would be more secure if he had a family, a wife, children, someone to keep him grounded. James didn't agree. He believed that love was unnecessary, and marriage was just a social expectation. He saw no reason to settle down, especially when his heart had been broken before. But the pressure from his family was growing. He had to do something to quiet their constant questions, and that's when Rachel Adams came into his life. Rachel was someone James had known for a long time. They had grown up in the same town, and their families were friends. However, as they grew older, their paths had diverged. James went off to college while Rachel stayed home to help care for her sick father. After a few years, Rachel had moved to the city to pursue a career in teaching, and James had barely kept in touch with her. Rachel was a kind, intelligent, and independent woman, but she wasn't immune to the pressures of life. Like James, she had struggled with her own relationships, and like him, she had kept her heart guarded. She had dated in the past, but no relationship had ever felt quite right. Her friends often told her that she was too focused on her career, but Rachel didn't mind. She had always been independent, and she wasn't sure if she wanted a relationship anyway, but the pressure from her own family was just as strong. They were always asking, "When are you going to settle down, Rachel? You're not getting any younger." Her parents had hoped for years that she would marry a good man and have children, but Rachel had not found someone who seemed right for her. It was during one of those family dinners, the kind where the pressure to be married or at least dating hung heavy in the air, that Rachel's phone buzzed. It was a text from James. She smiled as she read it. It had been a while since they had spoken, but she remembered him well. "Hey Rachel, long time no talk. I know we don't really keep in touch, but I've been thinking about something. I need your help with something important. Can we talk?" Rachel found herself curious. She hadn't heard from James in years, and she wondered what he needed help with. She quickly replied, agreeing to meet him the following day for lunch. When they met the next day, James seemed more serious than she remembered. He was dressed in his usual business attire, expensive suit, tie, and polished shoes. Rachel, on the other hand, was dressed casually, as she always was when meeting someone she considered a friend. They sat down at a quiet cafe, and James wasted no time. "I need to ask you something," he began, looking at her with a steady gaze. Rachel raised an eyebrow, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Sure, what's going on?" James paused, as if unsure of how to continue. "Well, it's about marriage," he said finally. Rachel blinked in surprise. "I know this may sound strange, but hear me out." Rachel leaned in, intrigued. James wasn't the type to talk about marriage or relationships at all. "Okay, I'm listening," she said. James took a deep breath. "I've been under a lot of pressure lately from my family and business associates. They all want me to get married. They think it will make me more successful, that it will help my image or something. But I don't believe in love. I don't want to marry someone for the wrong reasons. I don't want to marry for anything other than genuine feelings, but I'm tired of the pressure. So I was thinking," Rachel looked at him, unsure where this conversation was headed. "I was thinking," James continued, "that maybe we could get married. Just a marriage of convenience. We could both have the benefits of being married. People would stop asking me about it." And you would get the peace of mind of not having to deal with your family's constant questions. Rachel's eyes widened in disbelief. Wait, you want us to get married? Just like that? I know it sounds crazy, James admitted, but we're both in similar situations. You need to get your family off your back, and I need to do the same. It won't be anything more than a formality. We can still live our lives as we do now without any expectations. Rachel thought for a moment. She couldn't deny that she too felt the pressure from her family to settle down. And James wasn't asking for anything more than a simple arrangement. He wasn't asking her for love or romance. He was offering her a solution to her own problems, just as she was offering him one. Finally, after a long pause, Rachel nodded slowly. Okay, let's do it. James looked relieved, though there was something in his eyes that Rachel couldn't quite place. Thank you, Rachel. I promise this won't complicate anything. It'll just be a way to get everyone off our backs. They agreed on the terms of their marriage, both aware that they were entering into it for reasons far from love. Neither of them expected their arrangement to turn into anything more than a simple contract. But life had a way of surprising people, and neither James nor Rachel knew that this decision would change their lives forever. James and Rachel's marriage of convenience began in an atmosphere of quiet understanding. It was a practical decision, one that neither of them had expected to change their lives in any significant way. They had agreed that their marriage would be a simple arrangement, a way to satisfy the expectations of their families and business partners. There would be no romance, no emotional connection, just two people living under the same roof, each with their own separate lives. The first few weeks were awkward, yet oddly comfortable. James continued his busy work schedule, arriving home late at night, often too tired to engage in anything other than a quick dinner and a few words of conversation before retreating to his study. Rachel, on the other hand, had her own routine. She worked as a high school teacher, and after school she would either go to the gym or meet friends for dinner. The house was large, and each of them took to their own space, rarely crossing paths except for the occasional shared meal or brief exchanges in passing. James's family didn't know the truth about their marriage, of course. They thought everything was perfect, that James had finally made the decision to settle down. His mother in particular was thrilled. She had been pushing him to marry for years, and now that he had, she made it clear how pleased she was. "You've done the right thing, James," she told him during one of their frequent phone calls. "Rachel is a good choice. She's a nice girl, and you two will make a lovely couple." James nodded and smiled, but in his heart he didn't feel that connection to Rachel. He saw her as nothing more than a business partner in this arrangement. She wasn't the woman he had imagined spending his life with. Still, he was grateful that she had agreed to the marriage and that it was keeping his family off his back. Rachel's family, on the other hand, was relieved but cautious. They too were happy that she had finally found someone to marry. Her parents didn't know the full story behind the arrangement, but they accepted it. Rachel had always been the responsible one, the one who had taken care of everything when her father had fallen ill. They trusted her judgment, and if she believed this was the right choice for her, they would support her. But even though they lived in the same house, the gap between them remained wide. James was distant, absorbed in his work, and Rachel kept herself busy with her own life. There was no emotional attachment between them, no spark of romance or intimacy. They lived as roommates who happened to share a name on a piece of paper, nothing more. Yet as time passed, something began to change, though neither of them could pinpoint when it started. It began with small things, almost unnoticed. One evening, as they sat at the dinner table, James caught himself listening intently as Rachel talked about her day. She had a way of speaking, an enthusiasm about her work and her students, that he found both surprising and refreshing. He hadn't realized how much he missed genuine conversation until he heard the passion in her voice. Rachel, too, noticed subtle changes in James. There were moments when he would smile, when his eyes would soften as he spoke. At first she thought it was just a trick of the light or a shift in her own perspective. But there was something different about the way he interacted with her. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her wonder if there was more to this marriage than they had both first believed. One afternoon, Rachel returned home to find James sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an old family photo album. She could see the sadness in his eyes, the quiet reflection that seemed to consume him. She hadn't seen him like this before, and for the first time she felt a pang of sympathy for him. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a person with a past, with emotions that ran deeper than his carefully constructed exterior. She walked over to him and sat down across the table. "What's wrong, James?" she asked softly. James looked up, startled by her question. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to respond. But then, with a sigh, he closed the album and pushed it aside. "I was just looking through some old pictures. Memories, you know. It's been a long time since I've thought about the past." Rachel nodded, sensing that he didn't want to elaborate further, but she felt a connection to him in that moment, an understanding that she hadn't experienced before. They were both carrying emotional baggage, both struggling with their own personal histories, and for the first time since their marriage began, Rachel realized that she wasn't the only one who had hidden parts of herself. "I get it," she said quietly. "I have my own memories, too." James met her gaze, and for a brief second there was a silence between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the shared pain that both of them had carried for so long. But as quickly as it had come, the moment passed and James stood up. "I'll be in my study," he muttered, his usual businesslike tone returning. But Rachel noticed that something had shifted, something small but significant. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her realize that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to this marriage than either of them had first thought. Over the next few weeks, their interactions continued to evolve. They began to have longer conversations, talking not just about their daily routines but about their lives, their pasts, their hopes, and their dreams. These conversations weren't full of deep emotional exchanges, but they were genuine. There was a quiet comfort in the way they shared their thoughts with each other, and for the first time, Rachel started to look at James in a different light. She noticed the way he cared about his work, how he pushed himself to be the best at everything he did. She admired his dedication, even if she didn't always agree with his distant, solitary nature. In turn, James began to respect Rachel in ways he hadn't before. Her calm demeanor, her intelligence, and the way she handled her teaching job with such passion. He found himself thinking about her more than he expected. But even as they began to understand each other better, the truth of their arrangement was never far from either of their minds. They were still married out of necessity, not love. It was still a marriage of convenience. And yet both of them started to wonder, what if something more was beginning to grow between them? Neither of them could say for sure, but the idea lingered in the back of their minds. Despite their growing connection, there was still a wall between them. They were both too careful, too afraid of what it might mean if they allowed themselves to feel anything more. But the small changes, the moments of shared understanding, made one thing clear. Their marriage, once thought to be purely practical, was slowly beginning to transform in ways they never expected. It was a chilly Thursday afternoon when James sat in his study, sorting through some old boxes that had been tucked away for years. The house was quiet, as it usually was in the late afternoon. Rachel was at her school, finishing up some grading, while James had a few hours before he needed to attend a business meeting. He had been meaning to clear out some of his old things for months, but he had always pushed it aside. Today, though, there was something in him that needed to go through the past, something he couldn't ignore any longer. As he sorted through stacks of old papers, photos, and forgotten keepsakes, he came across something unexpected. A small, old box, its edges worn and a little scratched. He hadn't seen it in years. Slowly, he opened the box, and inside was a watch. It was an old tarnished silver watch, the kind that you could tell had been cherished even though time had left its marks on it. The watch had once belonged to his mother, a gift from his father many years ago. James remembered how his mother used to wear it every day, the silver band catching the light as she moved. He had loved the way it made her look elegant, even though she wasn't someone who cared about material things. But after his mother passed away when he was in his late 20s, the watch had vanished. James had searched for it in the months that followed, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find it. He had thought it was gone forever, lost perhaps in the chaos that followed her death. Holding it in his hands now, he felt a surge of emotion. It was more than just a watch. It was a connection to his past, to the mother he had loved so deeply, and to the part of his life that he had buried. For a long time, James simply stared at it, lost in memories. He thought about his childhood, the warmth of his mother's smile, and the comfort he had felt when she was alive. That was before the heartache of losing her, before everything changed. and it was before the walls he had built around his heart to protect himself from the pain of loss. A sudden sound brought him back to the present. The door to his study opened quietly and Rachel stepped in. She had finished her grading and decided to stop by to check on him. She often did that now, checking in with him more frequently than she ever had before. It wasn't that she had any particular reason for doing so. It was just that, over the past few months, she had begun to feel a connection to him, even if it was a small one. When she saw the watch in his hands, she immediately recognized it. "Is that your mother's watch?" she asked gently, her voice soft with curiosity. James looked up, startled at first, but then nodded. "Yes, I hadn't seen it in years," he said, his voice almost a whisper. There was a tenderness in his eyes, a vulnerability that Rachel hadn't seen before. She stepped closer to him, her eyes studying the watch. "I didn't know you still had it," she said, sitting down at the table beside him. There was a silence between them as they both looked at the tarnished silver watch. James's mind was racing, thinking back to the time after his mother's death. He had been devastated, and in his grief he had let go of so much, including the watch. He never wanted to feel that pain again, so he had buried it along with the memories. And now here it was again, brought to the surface by something as simple as a forgotten box. "Rachel," James said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I thought I lost this forever. I've searched for it, but it just disappeared." Rachel looked at him, sensing the depth of his feelings. "How did you find it now?" she asked, genuinely curious. "I don't know," James replied with a small shake of his head. "It was in a box I've never opened. I didn't even know it was there." He paused, taking a deep breath. "It's strange, you know? I thought I'd moved on, that I'd put everything behind me. But finding this, it's like a piece of the past came rushing back." Rachel nodded, her eyes softening. She could sense the pain in his words, the quiet sadness he carried with him. She knew that he had built a wall around his heart after losing his mother, but she hadn't realized just how much that loss had affected him. She reached out almost without thinking and gently touched his hand. "I'm sorry, James," she said quietly. "I didn't realize how hard that must have been for you." James looked at her, surprised by the softness in her voice. He had never shared this side of himself with anyone, not even his closest friends. But something about Rachel made it easier somehow. It wasn't that he was in love with her, not yet anyway, but he felt a connection to her that he hadn't expected. Maybe it was because she was the first person in a long time who had seen past the business persona he showed the world. "Thanks, Rachel," he said, his voice low but sincere. He hadn't expected her to understand, but she did. As they sat there in silence, Rachel couldn't help but notice the subtle change in James. He seemed more human, more vulnerable than he had been before. And as much as he tried to hide it, there was a part of him that was starting to open up. Maybe it was because of the watch, or maybe it was because of the quiet bond they had begun to form. Whatever the reason, Rachel felt something shift between them, a moment of quiet understanding that had never been there before. After a while, James stood up, carefully placing the watch back in its box. "I'll put this away for now," he said, his voice a little firmer. "I don't think I'm ready to wear it again, not just yet." Rachel stood up as well, her expression thoughtful. "Whenever you're ready, James," she said. "You'll know." James nodded, his gaze lingering on the box for a moment before he looked back at Rachel. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something deeper than just gratitude. "Thank you, Rachel. I think I'm starting to understand why this marriage might not be as simple as I first thought." Rachel smiled gently, though she didn't say anything. She simply nodded, accepting his words. They both knew that things were changing, though neither of them could yet see how it would all unfold. The days that followed the discovery of the watch brought a subtle change in the atmosphere between James and Rachel. Neither of them was quick to admit it, but something had shifted. The silent walls they had both built around their hearts were beginning to show cracks, yet even as they grew closer, neither one was ready to acknowledge it fully. They continued with their daily routines, each keeping their distance. But there was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet acknowledgement that things were no longer as they had once been. James, as always, threw himself into his work. He had learned long ago that the best way to avoid confronting his emotions was to stay busy. But now, even in the midst of his business meetings, he couldn't help but think about Rachel. He would find himself thinking about the way she laughed at the little things, how her eyes would light up when she spoke about her students. There was a softness in her that had drawn him in, something he hadn't noticed before. Rachel, for her part, found herself paying attention to James in a way she hadn't done at the start of their marriage. She noticed the tiredness in his eyes, the way he would sometimes look out of the window, lost in thought. It wasn't just his work that kept him occupied. It was something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the business world he had created. One evening, after dinner, Rachel found herself sitting in the living room, staring out of the window at the city lights. It was a quiet night, and for the first time in a while she felt a sense of calm. She hadn't realized how much she had missed moments of peace until now. Her life had been full of noise and obligations, school, family, friends, but now in the silence of the evening, she felt like she could finally breathe. As she sat there, James walked in, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. He was still in his suit, but his tie was loose around his neck, and he seemed less composed than usual. He hesitated for a moment, then sat down beside her on the couch. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice soft, almost tentative. Rachel smiled and nodded. "Of course," she said, gesturing to the empty space beside her. They sat in silence for a while, both looking out at the view. The city was alive with lights, cars passing by in a slow, steady rhythm. It felt like the world outside was moving fast, but inside the house, time seemed to stand still. After a long pause, James spoke. "I don't think I've ever really noticed how quiet it is here." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I guess I've been too caught up in work to appreciate it." Rachel nodded. "I know what you mean. I've been so focused on other things that I didn't realize how much I missed just sitting in silence." For a moment, they both looked at each other. There was a warmth in the air, a quiet connection that neither of them had expected. They were two people who had entered into a marriage for reasons of convenience, yet here they were, sharing a simple moment of peace. It felt real, in a way that neither of them could explain. "Rachel," James said, his voice breaking the silence, "I've been thinking a lot about the past few months, and about everything that's happened." Rachel turned to face him, curious but not saying anything. She wasn't sure where this conversation would go, but she could feel that something important was about to be said. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," James continued, his voice quiet but sincere. "But I think I've started to realize something. This marriage, it wasn't what I thought it would be. It's not just a simple arrangement anymore." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to say that, and the words caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft, unsure of how to respond. James looked at her, his eyes a little more open than she had seen them before. "At first I thought it was just about convenience. We both needed something, and this was the easiest way to get it. But now I don't know. I don't know if that's the whole story anymore." Rachel swallowed, unsure of what to say. She had been feeling the same way. She had thought that the marriage was a simple arrangement, something that would make life easier for both of them. But over time she had begun to feel something more, something that she hadn't expected. "I think I understand," Rachel said after a moment. "I've been thinking about it too. I didn't expect to feel anything, but sometimes I find myself thinking about you more than I should, and I wonder if I've been fooling myself into thinking this was just a business deal. It's harder to ignore than I thought." James smiled slightly, as if relieved to hear that she felt the same way. "I didn't want to admit it at first," he said. "I thought maybe I was just overthinking things. But when I think about you, about how you've been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it, I realize something's changed." Rachel felt her chest tighten, and for the first time, she allowed herself to really look at James, not just as a husband in a marriage of convenience, but as someone who had been there with her, day by day, even if neither of them had truly admitted it. "James," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't expect to feel this way either. But I think something is happening between us. It's not just the marriage anymore, is it?" James shook his head slowly. "No, it's not. I don't know what it is, but I don't think we can keep pretending that everything's the way it was." The words hung in the air between them, unspoken emotions and realizations swirling around them. They were both scared, both unsure of what the future held. But in that moment, they knew something had changed. They had started out as strangers bound by a contract, but now they were beginning to see each other in a new light. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, with the quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted in their relationship. It wasn't just about being married anymore. It wasn't about a simple arrangement. It was about the connection they had built, the small moments of care and kindness they had shared, and the growing bond that neither of them had expected. Rachel reached out, her hand brushing against James's. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. James looked at her, and for the first time since their wedding, he didn't see her as just a woman he had married out of convenience. He saw her as someone real, someone who had touched his life in ways he hadn't thought possible. "I'm glad we're doing this, Rachel," James said, his voice full of emotion. "I don't know where it's going, but I'm glad it's with you." Rachel smiled softly, her heart full. "Me too, James, me too." And in that moment, they both knew that whatever had started as a marriage of convenience was becoming something far more meaningful, something that neither of them had expected, but both of them had begun to cherish. The weeks that followed that quiet evening between James and Rachel felt like a turning point in their marriage. Though neither of them said it out loud, things between them were changing in ways they hadn't expected. What had begun as a simple practical arrangement was slowly transforming into something much deeper, much more meaningful. They had started as strangers with a shared purpose, but now they were beginning to understand each other in ways they hadn't thought possible. James continued his work as usual, but his focus had shifted. He found himself thinking about Rachel more often than he cared to admit. He would catch himself smiling at a memory of something she'd said, or feeling a strange sense of calm whenever she was near. It wasn't the same feeling of companionship he had imagined when they first got married. It was something more, something that felt real. Rachel, too, found herself in a similar situation. She had never imagined she would feel anything for James. They had entered this marriage with no expectations of love, but now, every little gesture from him seemed to carry more meaning. She noticed the way he would help her with the groceries when she came back from shopping, the way he would ask about her day with genuine interest. These were small things, but they added up. Over time, she realized that she was beginning to look forward to seeing him. She had never imagined that she could be so comfortable with someone who had once been nothing more than a business partner in this marriage. One evening, Rachel came home to find James sitting in the living room, flipping through some paperwork. He looked up as she entered, his eyes lighting up for a brief moment when he saw her. It wasn't the kind of look that suggested just familiarity. It was the kind of look that suggested something more, something unspoken. Rachel paused for a moment, unsure if she had imagined it, but the warmth in his gaze made her heart skip a beat. "Hey," James said, his voice warm and inviting. "How was your day?" "It was good," Rachel replied, dropping her bag on the table. "Busy, but good. How about you?" James smiled, though there was a trace of something deeper behind his eyes. "Same here. Just trying to get everything in order. You know how it is." Rachel nodded, but as she looked at him, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to this. The way they spoke to each other now was different, more natural, more intimate. It wasn't just about the daily routines anymore. There was a softness in their exchanges, a comfort that had grown over time. "I've been thinking," Rachel said suddenly, her voice hesitant, "about everything that's been happening between us." James looked at her, his expression serious but open. "What do you mean?" Rachel took a deep breath, her thoughts swirling. "I know we started this marriage for practical reasons. I didn't expect it to be anything more than that. But now, I'm starting to feel something different." "I think you are too." James blinked, surprised by her words. He had been feeling the same way, but he hadn't known how to say it. He had been waiting for the right moment, but he realized now that there wasn't going to be a perfect time to admit what he was beginning to understand. "You're right," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I've been feeling it too. Whatever this is between us, it's not just about convenience anymore. It's more than that. I don't know how it happened, but it did." Rachel's heart raced as she listened to him. The weight of his words sank in. It wasn't just her who had felt this shift. James felt it too. There was no denying it now. "I don't know what to call it yet," James continued, his gaze steady. "But I think I'm starting to realize that maybe we're more than just two people living together for the sake of appearances. Maybe there's something here that's worth exploring." Rachel smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. "I think I understand," she said quietly. "I never thought I'd say this, but I think I'm starting to care about you in a way I never expected. I don't know what that means for us, but it's true." The words hung in the air between them, as if they both knew they were standing at the edge of something new, something unknown. They had both been cautious, unsure of where this marriage would take them, but now they could no longer ignore what was growing between them. James stood up and walked over to Rachel. He stood before her for a moment, his expression serious but kind. "I don't know where this will go," he said quietly, "but I want to try. I want to see what happens when we stop pretending and actually face whatever this is between us." Rachel felt a surge of emotion in her chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel hopeful about the future. She wasn't sure what would happen, but she knew she was no longer willing to let fear stop her from exploring this new connection. "I want that too," Rachel whispered. Without thinking, James reached out and gently took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment it spoke volumes. There was no longer any doubt between them. They had moved past the point of being two strangers living under the same roof. They were starting to build something real, something worth holding on to. Over the next few weeks, James and Rachel began to explore their new relationship. They took small steps toward each other, finding moments to connect in ways they hadn't before. They started going for walks together, talking about their childhoods, their dreams, and their fears. They laughed more easily and shared quiet moments of understanding. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset together, Rachel looked at James and felt a deep sense of peace. She had never expected this marriage to lead her here, but now she couldn't imagine her life without him. The love they were beginning to build was not the kind of love she had expected. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And for her, that was enough. James looked over at Rachel, his gaze soft but full of emotion. "I don't know what the future holds," he said, his voice low, "but I'm glad we're doing this together." Rachel smiled, her heart full. "Me too, James, me too." And in that moment, they both understood that love, in its truest form, didn't always come in the way you expected. Sometimes it grew slowly, quietly over time. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about the small moments, the everyday kindnesses, and the shared understanding that, no matter what had brought them together, they were now on the same path. They had started as strangers, connected only by a marriage of convenience. But in the end, they had found something much deeper, a love born from respect, understanding, and the willingness to be open to the unexpected. And as the sun set on that quiet evening, James and Rachel knew that whatever the future held, they were ready to face it together.